Maybe there'll be a special security council which needs to be discussed and go. But these are structures of government. We're not talking about the political line these structures will take or whatever. But it'll be these structures of government which will include military representation. Is that where we are?
Look at it this way. It's kind of like handing over the keys to, you've got a house, you're handing it over. People are talking about, showing you around. This is the room for this is the room for this. We are not talking about the design of the room, who's going to live in it, and this is not the stage. We need the handover.
But the old owners of the house do feel they're going to be staying in the house
they
somewhere.
think they're staying there forever, and they're all like, maybe I can take this corner, But actually, it's and they're using political language like this, bringing up Sharia. No one's brought up Sharia. This is we have a constitution and a legislative body that's going to have representation. Not just of the DFC, and not the National Dialogue, pro-NCP guys, but there's always going to be representation. We are talking about, fixing up the house, basically, to kind of, these are the rooms and these are the functions, and then the transition, people moving on to transition with the civilian, bearing in mind that it is not any civilians, there are civilians that are represented through the streets. And which right now is the voice of the revolution. So the TMC cannot come one day and bring 100 civilians and say, okay, this is your civilian government.
Right.
So it has to be a representative civilian government. And the transition has to be represented by the people that have endured in these sit-ins for so long. So I think they're jumping the gun. Sometimes I think it's intentionally because they want to have these difficult conversations at this time. And these are definitely difficult conversations, but they will be done through proper consultation. And, we have a set of activities and consultations that are definitely have so much more representation than just the people who are in the sit-in. Because at the end of the day, everyone has a right to their voice, even people who have never been to the sit-in but have never been part of the government. But there are people like that who must be heard, definitely. So I think that the back and forth is a political issue. And I personally think that I personally think that there has to be a point where people just literally sit 2, 3, 10 days, however long it takes, and come up with an actual document. Because I think there's a lot of back and forth, as you mentioned, with the submission of the constitutional declaration by the DMC. I'm not sure if that's the translation for it, but the document. When they came back with the document, it didn't even answer that. It came back as a parallel document. It's almost like everyone's speaking to themselves.
Right.
So there needs to be a point where they're actually sitting and talking about structures. And the move from yesterday, which was, so they submitted this document, the TMC submitted through a press conference the document. The press conference and the document, first of all, the press conference shows that the trust is limited. When they put in the document, they immediately announced that we will be talking to other parties in the Friendship Hall, which is not a show of good faith. On the contrary, it's a show of there's others we want to listen to. And it blew back in their face because you know what happened there, right?
I think there was a bit of a fracas.
They hit each other with chairs.
Wow.
They lifted up chairs and hit each other. So it was just a shambles, but the thing was a joke.
They come, some of the people, other political groups are telling me they're fake parties. I don't know.
I think the word isn't fake. There are parties, but these parties were part of a whole conversation with the NCP. A lot of them only jumped ship 3 months ago. It took them many years to recognize that this government is flawed.
Okay.
And any party that didn't realize that this government is flawed instantly is got its issues. But even that, they participated with government. They became decision makers. They changed their positions. They never stood by the street. They never stood by the revolution. Right. There's a lot of other factors in it.
So what would be their role going
into the transition? Obviously, the NCP is out of the equation, and any NCP affiliated. But saying that legally, there are others.
Is it legally prescribed now as a party, the National Congress Party?
My understanding is that they're supposed to dissolve it. But it is very important to also understand that we have to talk about an inclusive transition.
It's got huge assets as well.
Yeah, it does.
I went past on Airport Road. There's an incredible skyscraper, which is
but they're part of
the
NCP these are the country's resources. I think the transitional justice will help with these types of elements. But I think it's important to talk about transition, that it will remain inclusive in the sense that there are parties that were not necessarily part of this corruption. Maybe smaller ones, whatever. We have to always, we have to remind ourselves all the time what is that not to cross that line of democracy and dictator, because opinion is opinion, but crossing the line on what you do with that opinion and having power over, we can't arrest people for having a different opinion, for example.
I mean, so these characters that left the NCP, the former ruling party, National Congress Party, and then set up their own entities. In theory, they could join in the transitional government,
but not in the not in the executive body.
No, but maybe in the legislative.
The legislative, which is over 120 people, so it's more like a parliament. I'm not well versed on it, but it's the legislative body. It's not in the leadership of the transition.
And I mean that does lead us to the issue of representativity again. So you've got your sovereign body, which I guess will be around the negotiating team, the DFC negotiating team. And then you've got your Council of Ministers similar. Now, there won't be direct elections, and everyone says, well, it's participation that counts, a different sort of notion of representativity. I mean, how is it going to work in practice?
Sorry.
I mean, the actual, the issue of how representative the Council of Ministers and indeed the Sovereign Council is of the millions of people involved in the protests across the country. I mean, how will they see this new transitional government?
I mean, ideally, the new transitional government, these councils should be answerable to the legislator, right?
Yeah.
So the legislative body, which will have all the representation.
Okay.
So we are talking about a system that is in place that actually makes everyone accountable.
Yeah.
And the accountability goes from legislation, the legislative body, every type of representation. So it's not just the FC in there. There's other people that don't necessarily agree. And as you probably seen all across the world, that they hit each other, definitely. On TV we see it, and not just in Sudan, it's across the world. That is the way it is. There's a lot of discussion, people from different backgrounds. That representation should be heard through these councils. So in an ideal, which is not an ideal, in the scenario that is being in place, this is an accountable transitional government.
Right.
It is not just a representative one. It's about accountability. There has to be institutions that are rebuilt. Accountability in terms of justice, in terms of if I'm not feeling that this ministry or this minister or this council is representing me, I have a way and I have a word and I have a say. If it's not in the street, it's through actual, legislative bodies, through institutions.
So if the Legislative Council, about, say, 120, 150 people strong, gets involved in writing the Constitution, they will then have some capacity to tour the country, taking soundings from all the various regions. And do you think in the end they come up with a new constitution, or new elements to the Constitution, they will put that to the country in the form of a referendum? People always... the history of Egypt next door, but also Britain in the last couple of years, people have become pretty skeptical about referenda. I mean, how do you think it's going to work?
To be very honest, I have no idea. Just to be about it. For me, I thought it was a process of... I don't know. That's a good question.
But one of the things to be ironed out.
Yeah, but I think I think it hasn't been reached that stage. But I think a referendum, I wouldn't say would actually be. I actually just heard today earlier before I met you that the UK and Israel don't have constitutions.
That's right. Which gives them infinite flexibility to
quite an interesting
contradict
thing.
themselves.
Yes, but the idea of the urgency, the TMC's urgency that we need the constitution back, even the 2005. It's a bizarre urgency. I think it gives an illusion that it's it's going to be the reason it collapses.
I mean, because there's some pretty good things in the Constitution from what I've heard, but they've never actually been enforced.
Yes. So it's the political will and the institution. I mean, I think what's really important to understand in this transition is that there is no one who is exempt from being questioned. There's no one who's not going to be accountable. There's always space to be and say who you are without any form of retribution. So you actually have to. I think that's what works for us. So referendum, constitution, how it's led, how it's done, the process, it makes it more difficult to implement, but I think it makes it more sustainable in the long term.
We still are faced with this idea of a 4-year transition, which I know gets mixed reviews. I mean, some people say way too long. There's all sorts of capacity for mischief. in those 4 years. Others are saying, actually, looking at the damage done to this country's economy, political fabric, 4 years might not even be enough. I was quite taken aback the other night. Lieutenant General al-Bashir said, it could take us decades to root out the deep state. As the guy next door to me said, does that mean he's going to be in power for decades? So you've got these issues. But I mean, there is a sort of a sense that 4 years is a hell of a long time.
Yeah, I think there's different reasons why people are concerned. First, I think we should start by the international community. The international community has been very vocal about its concern about the 4 years. And I will always ask the question of, because, a transitional government is not legitimate in the sense that, it's not an elected government. Right. I find it ironic since they've been working for 30 years with a non-elected
30
government.
Years.
So let's just put that one here, The 4 years, the world thinks of it is definitely not something that we need to be worried about, because I think it's definitely an issue that we have to deal with. The dismantling that has happened and the institution breakdown, not just at the opposition level or at the party levels, but also within the government. So you were talking about, for example, justice. The justice system has been NCP for 30 years. Imagine these people, if it hasn't been actually rebooted, and it's not just at the head of justice, everyone inside it, you're talking about a justice system that might actually risk real justice, and Omer al-Bashir can be released, or at least the ones under him, because it's a system that has these problems. So we need time. We need time to be accountable, to learn how to listen to each other, and to listen to people, and to listen to them, prioritize the citizens' well-being, prioritize rights, write a constitution, change some laws, change the way that institutions are about people and not about the actual frameworks. Because I think replacing NCP people with DFC or whatever is not the solution. In terms of institutions, the institutions should be almost revamped to be regulated so that people can actually, everyone can be accountable for it. And 4 years is, I think, more of an acceptable time. 2 years with all the consensus, the security arrangements for the armed groups. The peace file is a priority, and it might need a pre-transition phase of, let's talk about what are these armed groups going to, they're going to come, how is the reintegration, are they going to be part of army? There's a lot of process in terms of specifically the armed group issues. The other thing is that reconciliation, as you probably know from South Africa and Rwanda, reconciliation needs a lot of work, and it's a lot of social work that needs to happen. 4 years, I think, is an acceptable time.
I mean, that parallel with South Africa, a few people have raised that. Of course, the transition in South Africa was indeed 4 years. Mandela came out in 90 and they had elections in 94. Do you envisage that sort of comprehensive nature of the process here? It wouldn't obviously be very different in many respects. But going through those institutions, having that sort of hybrid rule. I
think that's the understanding. I wouldn't say just South Africa, but I think the understanding is to get some lessons learned from us historically. And that's probably one of the reasons that we're still in the street, because of the lesson learned from the previous military, the Intifada, and how it was fabricated. So yes, I think the understanding is that these 4 years will look like similar to the context.
I guess you should round off, because you've really been very brave with your voice, and without water and dry heat. You've got it all across. We started off by you talking about your family background and your father's business and so on. One thing that struck me about the protests and the Sudanese Professional Association is the role of business and economics in all this. Business, for all sorts of reasons, has come behind the protesters. Normally, in a lot of countries, business tries to cut a deal with the incumbent regime and then flip right at the last minute. Could you say something about the support of business?
Yes, I think that there's a lot that already came a bit too late, but there have been those that have come into the conversation prior to the 6th of April, and I think that for me it's an anecdotal thing. I have a friend from a prominent private sector business that on the 6th of April, on the first hour, we didn't have a connection. It was pretty hot.
Right.